Okay, Vino Madunai no Heno Aleno Maasea Denu Konina Aleno Maasea Denu Koneu. We're starting a new Shir Bezrat Hashem on Wednesday nights at 7:30. As it says, Kol Hat Halot Kashot. Every beginning is difficult. So at the end, you start with a few, and then Bezrat Hashem over the course of time, you have more. But at the end of the day, like we discussed, it's always quality, not quantity. I'd like to dedicate the Shir today for Refuah Shlema for my mother, Imi Morati Va'ateret Roshi, Ruth Bat Avraham. El Narafan Allah, El Narafan Allah, El Narafan Allah. Okay, so the topic tonight is going to be Mishnichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha. This concept that we have that when Adar comes in as a month, that we increase our simcha. And first, where is the source of this halacha? Where is the source of this? And the source of this is Masechet Ta'anit. Masechet Ta'anit, interesting enough, it's not mentioned at all in Masechet Megillah, but it's mentioned in Masechet Ta'anit, where there it's discussing the laws of Tisha B'Av, and there it says, Mishinichnas Av, Mima'atim B'Simcha. When Av comes in, when the month of Av comes in, we have an obligation to reduce our simcha. Amar Rav Yehuda Bered Rav Shmuel. Rav Yehuda, in the name of the son of Rav Shmuel, Bar Shilat Mishmei Rav, in the name of Rav, said, Kishem Kishemichnichnas Av Mima'atim B'Simcha. Just like when Av comes in, one has to reduce their simcha. Kach Mishnichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha. Similarly, just like one reduces the simcha on Av because of the mourning in Tisha B'Av, one has to increase their simcha on Adar. But the key factor is that we see clearly, it just says to lift up the simcha or to lower it. But the baseline of a Jew is always to have some level of simcha. In Adar, we increase the simcha. In Av, we reduce the simcha. But there always has to be simcha there. So let's continue on. The Gemara continues on. How do we show this increase in simcha? What's the manifestation of that? Amar Rav Papa said, Hilkach, the halacha is, Bar Yisrael, a Jewish person, Di'itle dina behadei nochri, when he has a court case against a Gentile, Lishtemit mine be'av, he should avoid going to court against a Gentile in the month of Av. Why? Because this is not a good time. Diri'ah mazaleh, that shall we say, the mazal, or the abundance, the flow of abundance on Av is less for the Jewish people. The concept of mazal is very interesting. I just want to discuss it very briefly. It says there's no mazal for the Jewish people, which means they have no mazal. Maybe that is a nation, but as an individual, that's different. So as a nation, the Jewish people are not with mazal, but as individuals, we are. But even more so, what is the word mazal? Mazal is luck. What does luck mean? There's no such thing as luck. Everything is siyata d'shmaya. So the word mazal comes from there's a pasuk in Balak that says Yizal mayim midaliyav, that water should pour from its source, which means the word Yizal and mazal means pouring, which means there's an abundance, there's shefa. So when a person has mazal, what that means that they have shefa, they have more shefa. When a person doesn't have mazal, they have less shefa. So clearly in the month of Av, the Jewish people have less shefa, because that's the time with have all kinds of terrible things that happen to the Jewish people in the month of Av, which of course began with the sin of the Miraglim. So therefore there's a decrease in shefa, because what decreases shefa is avonot. What increases shefa? Mitzvot. So since Av is a month where we made a very big sin in the time of the Midbar, and there are continuing manifestations of those sins later, we see that that's a month where there's decreased shefa. So if a person's going to go against a Gentile in the month of Av, it's not a good idea, because the Jewish people have less shefa at that time, and there's an increased likelihood that one is going to lose the case. But instead, what he should do is try to bring the case against the Gentile in the month of Adar, because just like the month of Av has less shefa, the month of Adar has more shefa. Okay, now it's interesting because Purim is celebrated on the 14th, or if it's in a walled city since the time of Yehoshua ben Nun, it's in the 15th. But we see the concept of Simcha in Adar is not limited to Purim. We could see that, for instance, Pesach, we have a mitzvah to be sameach on the holiday of Pesach, right? Extra simcha, shall we say, more than is the baseline. But there's not necessarily an increase of simcha in the entire month of Nisan. There's no idea that one is supposed to have more simcha in the entire month of Nisan. Or, for instance, Hanukkah. We're going to talk about the differences between Hanukkah and Purim. On Hanukkah, there's also a concept of simcha, but it's not for the entire month of Kislev. It doesn't say Mishnichnas Kislev Marbim Simcha. Only for the 8 days of Hanukkah is a person obligated to have an extra level of simcha, and we'll talk about that, right? And there's machloket. We'll see if that was the case with that. But where do we learn that it's not just Purim, but it's the entire month of Av that one has simcha? And unlike Tisha B'Av, where the Etzev, the sadness of Tisha B'Av, goes from Rosh Chodesh Av for Sfaradim, not necessarily including Rosh Chodesh, for Ashkenazim from Rosh Chodesh. It's really until the 10th in the morning. That's when the Bet Mikdash was completely, the most of the burning happened on the 10th. But the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, these are not days of sadness. These are actually days of, shall we say, happiness. So it's almost like Tisha B'Av is only for those first 10 days. In fact, Tu B'Av is a tremendous day of Yom Tov for the Jewish people. So we understand that. So where do we learn that that Adar, it's the whole month? And the Pasuk says in the Megillah, in chapter 9, verse number 22, Kayamim asher nahu bahem haYehudim me'oibehem, on the days where the Jewish people rested from their enemies, ve'chodesh asher nepach lahem yagon l'simcha, and the month where it was changed from them from being sad to being happy, ume'evel Yom Tov, from mourning to Yom Tov, lasot otam yemei mishteh v'simcha, to do the days of Purim, to have mishteh v'simcha, umishloach manot ish l're'ehu, and gifts giving between two people, friends, okay, or not friends, two Jewish people, they don't have to be friends. In fact, mishloach manot ideally should be given to someone we've had problems with. Umatanot le'evyonim. Here's where we learn the mitzvot that are included in the day of Purim. We're going to talk about that. Great question. Let's talk about that. Okay, we're going to get to that. So clearly, the pasuk says "V'chodesh asher nepach lahem," which means what? That the simcha that a Jew is supposed to experience, the extra simcha, is for the entire month of Adar, from Rosh Chodesh Adar until the end of Adar, which is, of course, the beginning of the month of Nisan. Excellent question. So that means in a regular year where there's only 1 month of Adar, Mishnichnas Adar Marbim Simcha, that means only for that month of Adar. But what about like our year this year where we have a leap year? We have Adar Aleph and Adar Bet. What is the situation there? So from here we understand, it says in Masechet Megillah, it says, Karu et Megillah ba'Adar Harishon. What happens if they read the Megillah on the first Adar? But then nit'abera hashana, which means the messengers didn't get to Bavel or wherever they were. So they read the Megillah on the 14th, thinking that there was only 1 month of Adar. But in Jerusalem, they declared the Chodesh and they were mit'aber the Shana. They decided, and that was a decision that was made not based on the calendar, even though the calendar was always there. They would make it by Re'iyat HaLevana. They would go and testify, and then the messages would go out to all of the places in the exile. And we understand we have a concept of Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galiyot, because sometimes those messengers wouldn't arrive until the middle of the month. So when Adar comes, celebrates Purim on the 14th of Adar. And now what happens if the messengers came and said, by the way, the Bet Din in Jerusalem said, we have 2 months of Adar this year. Okay? Korin Ota Badar Sheni. So the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah must be fulfilled in Adar Sheni. Cannot be fulfilled in Adar Aleph. And Ben Adar, now this is what the Mishnah says. And Ben Adar Harishon Adar Hasheni. There is no difference between the first month of Adar and the second month of Adar. Ela Kriyat Megillah umatanot la'evyonim. So from here we understand other halachic aspects of Adar are for Adar Aleph and Adar Bet, and this is where it's learned, according to some of our poskim, that the mitzvah of Simchaf Adar is for Adar Aleph and Adar Bet. Not everybody agrees with that, but from a halachic point of view, to have extra Simchan Adar, I don't think anybody should be arguing with that. It's always nice to have extra simcha. Okay. Now, the big question, we discussed the halachic ramifications of simcha, that if a Jew has a court date, they try to push it to the month of Adar rather than doing the month of Av. But are there any other manifestations of that simcha? For instance, we said that the Megillah says, because that was a month, the Na'afochu, that it was switched from Yagon Lanacha. So there's another pasuk in the Megillah, in chapter 9, verse number 27, where it says, Ki yimu v'kiblu ha-Yehudim alehem ve'al zaram, the Jewish people fulfilled and accepted upon themselves and on their descendants, on their children, ve'al kol hanivim alehem, and all those that are connected to them, v'lo ya'avor, and they shall be keeping this forever. Osim et shnei hayamim ha'ele, they do these 2 days, which is Yudalit and Tetvav, depending if it's a walled city or not, kichtavam b'chizmanam, according to their writing and according to the appointed time, b'chol shana v'shana. So this is one of the places where the Gemara learns out that the holiday of Purim will never be batel, that even in the time of the Mashiach, the holiday of Purim will not be batel. And we're always going to be reading the Megillah on Purim, because it says over here, liot forever, okay? It doesn't mean that the rest of the holidays are not going to be celebrated. Best way to understand that is the concept of batel b'shishim. Just like when a person is cooking a cholent, a little bit of milk falls inside, yes? And as long as it's 60 times that amount, the cholent is kosher. Now, of course, if a person has anaphylaxis to milk, they should not eat that cholent, okay? Because while it's kosher, it may be dangerous for their health, okay? But the way the halacha views it is that that milk doesn't exist because it's batel. So the concept of batel means it's really there. There are molecules of milk and lactose inside the cholent, but the halacha says it doesn't exist. So when we say all the holidays are going to be batel, it doesn't mean we're not going to fast on Yom Kippur. It doesn't mean we're not going to eat matzah on Pesach. What it means is a redemption from the exile in the time of the Mashiach is going to be so great, 60 times the exile of Yetziat Mitzrayim in greatness. So kavyachol, the holidays will be batel, b'shishim, right? So when we're going to go to tell our children the story of Pesach, they're going to say, Dad, that's great, but I want to hear the story of Yetziat Boca Raton. That's really what I want to hear, because that's going to be 60 times greater. That's one of the ideas of what it means all the holidays will be batel. But Purim, even under those circumstances, is not batel. But what else do we learn from the concept of kiyamu v'kiblu? What does this mean, kiyamu v'kiblu? So the Gemara tells us in Masechet Shabbat, what is kiyamu v'kiblu? Amar Rava. Rava said, Afilu hachi lo kib. I'm sorry. Afal pi shemitchila kiblu Yisrael Torah. We know, we just read 2 parashot ago, that the Jewish people accepted the Torah where? On Har Sinai. What did they say? Naaseh v'nishma. Yes? But we have a problem, because if you also see, there's another place, it says, Vayityatzvu betachtit tahar. And if you look at Rashi, what does Rashi say over there? Hashem lifted the mountain over their heads and said to them, if you accept the Torah, fine. If you don't accept the Torah, I bury you under the mountain. Okay, which is it? Did they accept the Torah, or were they forced to accept the Torah? And there's a big difference. What's the big difference? Because a Jew that is forced to do something against the halacha by something that is not in his control, they are patur. Anus rahamana patra. Which means if I'm in Yom Kippur and a Gentile comes and forces me, there's a whole discussion of that in Masechet Yomah, and puts food in the back of the throat, to the place where when food goes back there, you have no choice. It's involuntary. You have to swallow. Are you chayav karet? Absolutely not, because you were forced. You had no choice. So we understand the concept of anus. So how do we understand this? So when they said Naaseh v'nishma, that was only for the written Torah. And once they accepted the written Torah, then Hashem said, okay, but there's a buy one, get one free over here. That's the first time in history where the Jewish people said, we don't want the buy one, get one free. No, we don't want the oral Torah. So Hashem lifted up the mountain and said, there's no way. Once you accept the written Torah, it comes automatically oral Torah. and that we accepted by force. So that means that technically, if you think about what we said before, anything that would have been in the oral Torah, the Jewish people would have been peturim from, because they were forced to accept it. When it says over here, kiyamu v'kiblu, what does it mean? Afilu hachi, even so, that over there they accepted the Torah on Har Sinai. Hadar kiblu b'mei Achashverosh. They once again accepted the Torah on Purim. What does it say? Dichtiv kiyamu v'kiblu. Kiyamu is naaseh. The kiblu is nishma. So here is where the Jewish people accepted the Torah in completion, the Torah shebechtav and the Torah shebal peh. Kiyamu ma shekiblu kvar. They agreed to accept what they had already forcefully accepted in the past. Okay? What does that have to do with simcha? What does it have to do with simcha? We have a pasuk in Tehillim, chapter 19, verses 8 and 9. What does it say? Torat Adonai temima meshivat nafesh. Edut Adonai ne'emana mahkimat peti. The Torah of Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, is perfect, or is shalem, is complete, restoring the soul. The testimony of Hashem is sure, and it is making wise the simple. Meaning what? We see this concept of the Torah brings a person to meshivat nefesh, to relaxation. Next pasuk, Pikudei Adonai Yesharim Mesamech Lev. Mitzvat Adonai bara me'irat inayim. So we see from this pasuk what? That the statutes, the Torah brings a person to a level of simcha. That's why on Tisha B'Av, there's a prohibition to study much of the Torah. One is allowed to study Torah like Hilchot Avelut. One's allowed to study laws of, let us read Echa. A person's allowed to study Midrash Echa. But a person's allowed to study parts of the Torah and the Navi that are talking about punishment. A person's also allowed to study the part of Gitin that discusses destruction of the temple. Because why? Because the goal of Tisha B'Av is not to have that simcha, and generally Torah brings simcha. So when the Jewish people accepted the Torah on Purim, that brought simcha, which is another idea why Purim is connected to simcha. There's another pasuk in Mishlei, in chapter 15, verse number 30, that says, Me'or einayim yisamach lev, shemu'at tova tiddashen asem. The light of the eyes gives simcha to the heart, and a good report makes the bones fat. So if we look at Metzudat David, where it's one of the commentaries on the Tanakh, what does he say, Me'or einayim? Ha'arat einayim, which means when a person's eyes are opened, which means when something is unclear, that then becomes clear. Specifically, bidvar ha'mesupak, in something that is doubtful. If a person has a doubt, there's some type of a doubt, that's a frustrating place to be. That is not a happy place to be when a person has a doubt about something. So we understand that when a person's eyes are opened and there's a resolution of doubt, what does that bring? Simcha. That's what this pasuk is saying. So with the resolution of doubt, yisamach lev. Ki en ba'o. This is what the Metzudat David says. Ki en ba'olam simcha ki hatarat hasfekot. There is no greater simcha to a person than the resolution of doubt. And why is that important? Because we understand in the Megillah, the battle was against Amalek. Amalek represents doubt. The gematria of the word Amalek is 240. The gematria of the word Safek is 240. Why did Amalek come to us in Midbar? Hayesh Adonai b'kirbenu im ayin. The Jewish people had a doubt. Is Hashem with us or not? Next pasuk, Vayavo Amalek vayilachem im Yisrael b'refidim. So we see in the Megillah, when we were successful in destroying Amalek, what does that mean? We destroyed the doubt. But even more than that, what allows the Jew to destroy Amalek? There is only one thing. One cannot have doubt. When Moshe's hands go up, the Gava Yisrael. When Moshe's hands go down, the Gavar Amalek, which means Moshe Rabbeinu's hands don't make the war. That's what Rashi says. But when the Jewish people look to Hashem, which means they have faith in Hashem 100%, that allows them to be victorious against Amalek. When they don't have faith in Hashem 100%, then Amalek wins. So anytime there's a battle against Amalek and we are successful, like we see in the Megillah, what does that mean? That all the Jewish people were able to remove all of the doubt from their hearts, which is, according to the Mitzudat David, a source of tremendous simha. In fact, this is going to explain the halachic difference between Hanukkah and Purim, because we'll see shortly that there's a little difference between these two holidays. Hanukkah was not a battle against Amalek. Hanukkah was a battle against Yavan, which is not Amalek. So therefore, while there is simha associated with Hanukkah, it's not the same as Purim. End of the pasuk is Shimua Tova. What is Shimua Tova? So that's when a person hears good news, Tidashen Atzem, which means a person gets swollen when they hear good news. And we're going to see an example of this from Masechet Gitin shortly. But the Mitzudat David says, Bidvar Chidushe HaTorah. What is Shimua Tova? When a person hears a novel Torah idea, something that is a chidush, something that they have never heard before. And what does that do? That brings also simha. For what do we say before? Pikudei Hashem misamech halev, which means when a person wants to get to know Hashem, wants to get close to Hashem, and he hears or she hears a Torah idea that is something amazing, that gives a person simcha. So in Masechet Gitin, it brings an example that I'm not going to go through the whole thing right now. Yochanan ben Zakkai had to get snuck out of Jerusalem, yes? And he goes, and who does he go to meet? He meets Vespasian, Aspasianos, who at that point was the general of the Roman army. Remember, Vespasian's son, his name was Titus. Titus is the one who destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, not Vespasian. What happened? It says over here, Adachi, what happened? In the meantime, while Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Vespasian were talking with each other, Ata presteka ale merome. Messengers came from Rome and came to Vespasian Amarle and said to him, Kum demit le Caesar, because the Caesar died, which means your predecessor, the one who was Caesar in Rome, died. Which Caesar was that? Nero. The Amre hanehu hashive deromel otivach bereshe. And the leaders of Rome, the Senate, met, and they decided to appoint you the new emperor. And then the Gemara tells us, Hava sayem had misaneh, that what happened was Vespasian was in the middle of putting on his shoes. He had put one shoe on. He was about to put the other shoe on. And what happened? He couldn't put it on. It didn't fit. And he went to put on the shoe, and it wouldn't go on. So it's ridiculous to walk around with one shoe. So what did he do? He tried to take off the shoe that he had just put on, and what happened? It wouldn't come off. So what happened? Vespasian said to the rabbi, what happened? Amar le, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, you know what happened? Shimua tova atyalach. You heard good news. What was the good news? That you are now going to be the king. You're going to be the emperor. Dichtiv, and he brings the pasuk we just quoted that says, Shimua tova tidashen atzem. That good news makes a person swell, and that's how the Gemara describes this pasuk. Elamai takante. So what is Vespasian says? Well, how do I fix this? I can't have no shoes. I can't go to Rome with no shoes on. How do I fix this? Lete inish dela miyatva datach mineh. Let a person pass by that you don't like. And what's going to happen? When you see that person, you're going to get upset. And what's going to happen? Your feet will return back to normal. And that's exactly what happened. So we understand over here that this idea that good news makes a person feel good. Yes? Now let's go back to what we said about the chidush. That was the first opinion. The second opinion of the Mitzudat David is what? That divrei Torah make a person happy. Chidushim, novel ideas. So we just read 2 weeks ago. What does it say? B'chodesh hashelishi, letzet bnei Yisrael me'eretz Yisrael, bayom hazeh ba'u midbar Sinai. in the third month that the Jewish people left Egypt, of course, this is the month of Sivan, Bayom Hazeh, on this very day, Ba'u Midbar Sinai. So the Gemara Rashi asks a question, or says, first of all, what is Bayom Hazeh? What does that mean? Rosh Chodesh, which means they came to Sinai when? On Rosh Chodesh, Sivan. Lo hayat tzarich lichtov ela bayom hahu. It should have written on that day. What is Bayom Hazeh? What is this idea, Yom Hazeh? It should have said Bayom hahu on that day, not on this day, right? That day is separated from me. This day is right now. Ma'u Bayom Hazeh, Rashi says, Sheyu divrei Torah hadashim alecha. It teaches us that words of Torah should be new to you, kilu hayom netanam, like they were first given to you today. And my Rabbi Nissim Levi, explained to me many years ago that there are three different types of chidushim. When a person goes to sleep at night, he goes to the shamayim. In the shamayim, they don't care about how much money you made. In the shamayim, they don't care about what kind of stock deals you did. In the shamayim, they don't care about the news between what's going on in America and the politics. All they want to hear are the chidushim. They want to hear, what chidush did you hear in the world? And the neshama, when it goes to the shamayim, if it doesn't have a chidush, feels very uncomfortable because other people come with chidushim that they heard, and this neshama doesn't have any chidush. So there's a Gemara that says, "En bet midrash below chidush." There's no bet midrash that has no chidush. So how do we understand this? There are three kinds of chidushim. One kind of chidush is, no one has said this since the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. I saw something in the Torah. I looked for everybody else. I thought of an idea. No one has written this. Not Rambam, not Ramban, not the Ibn Ezra, not Orach Chaim. No one has written this idea that I can find. And you know what? We've had some of the smartest people in the history of the world pour over the Torah. But there's still things that have yet to be revealed. And you come up with an idea that has not been said since the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. That is a massive chidush. Now, there's a second kind of chidush. I didn't see it anywhere. I came up with an idea. It's a great idea, but I look and I see that Rambam mentions it in the Moreh Nevuchim, or the Ramban says it, or Ibn Ezra says it, or the Orach Chaim says it. Don't feel bad. What does that mean? That means that your learning is so strong that you're mechaven to the da'at of one of the great rabbis. That should give a person tremendous happiness, because while it may not be the first time in history it was written or said, he came up with it all on his own. That's the second level of chidush. But there's a third level of chidush that anyone can partake of. And this is what Rashi is hinting to. You know what? I read Kriyat Shema today. I know I read it yesterday. I know I read it the day before. But when I read it this time, I felt as if it was the first time I read it. That is a chidush. And in the Shamayim, when a person has that level of excitement, even it's a Devar Torah that he's read over and over again, Patah Eliyahu, the Hallelujah, but he feels like it's the first time, that's a chidush. And the Shamayim wants to hear about that. And that's a chidush that's open to anyone. One doesn't have to be a big Talmid Chacham in order to benefit from that level of chidush. Continuing on, in Perkei Avot, it says, we're talking about simcha. So we discussed a little bit about the concept of simcha. First and foremost, destroying Amalek, which is hatarat sfekot. That's another level of simcha. Any type of Torah a person is learning with chidush, that's simcha. Kiyimu v'kiblu. Now let's discuss another aspect of simcha. Rabbi Nehunya ben Hakana Omer. Who's Rabbi Nehunya ben Hakana? He's the author of a very famous Kabbalistic book called Sefer HaBahir. And what does he say? Kol hamekabel alav ol Torah. Anyone who accepts upon himself the yoke of the Torah. What does it mean, yoke of the Torah? It's not voluntary. We are servants of Hashem. The Torah is not good ideas. It's not advice. These are commandments. The master has given these commandments. We accepted them on Har Sinai, swore we're going to keep them, and now we're obligated. We're like avadim. We're not like, we are avadim. That is what it means, Ol Torah. It's a yoke. Just like a cow or an ox has a yoke on his neck. He doesn't have a choice. If he wants to go sit in the sun and relax, it doesn't make a difference. He's got to drag the plow. Why? Because the yoke is on his neck. That's the concept of the Ol Malchut Shamayim. When a person accepts upon himself the Ol of the Torah with simcha, with happiness, ma'avirin mimenu Ol Malchut ve'Ol Derech Eretz. What's removed from him is the yoke of the government and the yoke of having to make a living. It doesn't mean that he's not under the rule of the government. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have to go to work. But when a person is accepted upon himself that he's a slave to Hashem, it doesn't make a difference what goes on at work. It doesn't make a difference what goes on in the government. Why? Because there's only one boss. That's it. V'chol haporek mimenu ol Torah, but anybody who removes himself from the ol of Torah, who thinks that they can remove the yoke of the Torah from their neck, notnin alav ol malchut ve'ol derech eretz. What has he get? He gets the ol of the government, and he gets the yoke of derech eretz to make a living. Which means people, again, there are some people that can make a living very easily. There's some people that make a living that have to put effort. But the question is it a ol? Is it a yoke? If a person already has a yoke of shamayim, there's no room on your body for any other ol. When a person doesn't have the ol of the Torah on his neck, then he has the ol of the malchut and the ol of the derech eretz. In Kohelet, it says, Ohev kesef lo yisba kesef. Meaning what? A person who loves money will never be satisfied with money. Just look at what we see over here. We have very wealthy people that we know are very, very well. Yes? And wealthy people, they still work. They may buy a yacht. They buy 2 yachts. They may come to live in Palm Beach or in Miami. Yes, because they don't want to pay taxes in Washington State. Whatever the story is. But they still work. Why do they have to work? Someone who's got billions and billions of dollars, they never have to go to work again. Donald Trump, a perfect example. Here's a guy who's a billionaire. Being president of the United States is a lot of work. Now, you might say he's feeding his ego, and that could be the case, but at the end of the day, he doesn't need it. He doesn't need that responsibility. He doesn't need that. Let him play golf in Mar-a-Lago all day long and invite world leaders to come play golf together. So we see that when a person is interested in the kesef, we see that there's no end to the satisfaction. That's why it also says in Kohelet that a person dies and only half of his desires are fulfilled, which means no matter who the person is, whether it's Jeff Bezos, Donald Trump, after 120 years, when they leave the world, only half of their desires are fulfilled. But when a person has the ratzon to get close to Hashem, nothing else makes a difference. Any questions?
During the Purim, what was the 60 days of 6 months of the party that Achashverosh did in the castle, and where did he find the vessel from the Beit HaMikdash that they used the vessel to eat on?
That's a good question. Okay, so who destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, the first one? Bavel, right? Achashverosh was king of what kingdom? Paras. What happened? Bavel, Nebuchadnezzar, destroyed Jerusalem and took all the temple vessels and brought them to Bavel, with the exception of the Aron Kodesh. That was buried, and he never got that, okay? What happened to Nebuchadnezzar? He had a son who was led for a brief period of time, and then there was another person who ruled, Daryavesh, not the son of Esther, a different Daryavesh, okay? And then what happened was Achashverosh overthrew the previous, which means Achashverosh had no right to the throne. He basically, just like we see in many, look at the first couple of caliphs of the Muslims. What happens? Had the next one become caliph? By killing the one before, right? So this is how one moves up in the world, through assassination, right? Not through elections, but through assassination, yes? So Achashverosh was able to take over the kingdom through assassination, but he had a problem. His problem was he had no legitimacy to be a king. He was not from a descendant of kings. So what did he do? He married Vashti. Vashti was a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. I think she was his granddaughter. So Vashti gave him legitimacy. What happened? He basically recognized, because everybody knew that Jeremiah said that in 70 years, the temple would be rebuilt. And what happened is, remember, Koresh, who was the king of Paras, who took over for the descendant of I don't know the exact order, Koresh allowed the Jewish people to go up and build the temple. Achashverosh, through Vashti's instigation, stopped the building of the temple because she said, my grandfather destroyed their temple. If you let them rebuild their temple, they will get close to their God, and then they will once again be invincible. Do not allow them to build the temple. So Achashverosh stopped the building of the temple. And what happened? This was the 52nd year after the destruction of the temple. When Jeremiah said that the temple would be built in 70 years, what does that mean? 70 years from the destruction, not 70 years from the exile of Yehoiachin. Yehoiachin was the last king before Tzidkiyahu was put in. Tzidkiyahu was a melech, if I'm not mistaken, for 18 years. But Yehoiachin was basically the last king, and he was taken into exile. He was blind, all that kind of stuff. He has been into exile. So Achashverosh and his experts calculated the 70 years from the Galut of Yehoiachin. And so what happened? In the time of the Megillah story, they felt, based on that Jeremiah's prophecy was false, or it already that Jewish people are not worthy to have the temple built. So that's why Achashverosh made this party, to show that that the Jewish people are never going to rise up again. What was the problem? When the Megillah, when the Gemara in Masechet Megillah asks, why did the Jewish people in that generation deserve to be completely destroyed? What was the conclusion of the Gemara? Because they ate at the party. What's the big deal? They ate at the party. So what? The party was celebrating that the temple was not going to be rebuilt. Oh, you Jewish people forget about your prophets. You lose hope that what was written in the prophets is going to come true. You don't deserve to live. And that's why Haman rose up. He killed Vashti because he wanted to show that he doesn't need her anymore. He doesn't need Vashti and Nebuchadnezzar because the prophecy of Jeremiah was already exhausted. And because the Jewish people participated, okay, and what Achashverosh did is he brought out the kelim, because he conquered from Paras, right? He was Paras. They had the utensils from Bavel, and then he brought out the utensils in the party, and the Jewish people participated. They saw the utensils, and they still ate at the Seudah. And Achashverosh made everything. He made sure the ORB had their hashgacha. He made sure Rabbi Gornish in Brooklyn had the hashgacha. He made sure everybody had the badats. They had whatever, the Rabbanut Rashit, whatever hashgacha they liked was available, because he wanted every Jew to feel comfortable eating at this party and celebrating the temple is not going to be built. Did that answer your question? And 6 months. 6 months, okay? Culminating in the last week. And the last day of the party, the last day fell on what day? Fell on Shabbat and Yom Kippur. And the Jewish people didn't come. They didn't come. That's the refuah. That was the teshuvah for what they did. Okay? All right. Continuing on in Masechet, in the Mishneh Torah of the Rambam. So we want to analyze. We have two rabbinic holidays. One is called Chanukah, and one is called Purim. And we have some differences. So the Rambam says, Mitzvat Yom Yudaled, the day of the 14th, Livnei Kfarim, for people living in the villages, the Ayarot, and in the unwalled cities. The Yom Tedvav Livnei Krachim, and Yom Tedvav is for the people who live in those in walled cities, right? Liyot Yom Simcha Umishteh. The Rambam uses what language? Purim is Simcha Umishteh. which means happiness and drinking. Umishloach manoch l'reim atal evyonim. Yes? Okay. What does he say about Hanukkah? Mipinezeh, Rambam says, Hitkinu Chachamim, the stage is established, Shebe'oto Hador, in that generation, Shu Shimonat Hayamim Ha'elu, these 8 days, Shetchilatan Kafhei, Bekislev, from the 25th of Kislev, Yemeh Simcha Vehalel. So what do we see? While Simcha is a feature of both Chanukah and Purim, Chanukah has the concept of Simcha and Hallel. Purim has the concept of Simcha and Mishteh. Now, we don't say Hallel on Purim, but the Gemara gives a different reason why we don't say Hallel on Purim, because the Megillah is the Hallel of Purim. But we see from here that there's a difference between, even both of them have a level of Simcha. One is Simcha v'Hallel, one is Simcha and Mishteh. And now, if we look at the Shulchan Aruch, we see the difference is magnified in another way. In the Shulchan Aruch regarding Hanukkah, what does it say? Ribuy ha-seudot. That some people have the custom that on Hanukkah they have lots of seudot, lots of festive meals. Shemarbim bahem, right? That they have many seudot. Hem seudat hareshut. They are not chova. They are reshut, which means you don't have to have a seudan Hanukkah. What's the mitzvah of Hanukkah? You light the Hanukkah candles. Some women have the custom not to do melacha for 30 minutes after the Hanukkah candles are lit. But there's no mitzvah to have a seudat Hanukkah. What's that? Okay, but that's not when we say seudah, that's yain. There's no association of the simcha of Hanukkah with eating. It's a simcha with Hallel. And that's why the Shulchan Aruch says that when a person has a seudah in Hanukkah, it's reshut. And that's what Chamavadia says, a person should have a siyum, have divrei Torah, have songs, and this way you make it a seudat mitzvah, because without that other aspect, seudat on Hanukkah, of course with the exception of on Shabbat, are not seudat mitzvah. But by Purim, because what, and he says, what? Shelo kivaum lemishteh v'simcha. Because Hanukkah was not established for mishteh v'simcha. Hanukkah was established for Hallel v'simcha. Now, let's contrast. What does the Shulchan Aruch say by Purim? What does he say there? Haggah, this is the Ramah. Mitzvah leharbot beseudat Purim. And the Shulchan Aruch doesn't disagree with this. There's a mitzvah to have seudah on Purim. Useudah achat yotzim. And a person could be yotzeh with one seudah. Which seudah? The one we have in the daytime. All of the mitzvot of Purim, the only one that's done is night is Mikra Megillah. But a person does Mikra Megillah in the day does not fulfill his obligation, because he also has to have Mikra Megillah in the day. Men and women, no difference. But in the daytime is Mishloach Manot. In the daytime is Matanat Levyonim. And in the daytime, of course, is Seudat Purim. That is the Seudat Chova. That is a required Seudah. And that Seudah should involve basar and yain. We'll see shortly. Okay? It certainly has to involve bread and yain. Okay? So now the Shulchan Aruch adds, Seudat Purim she'as'a balayla yo lo yatzai de chovato. Shulchan Aruch says the seudah that you do on Purim at night, a person is not yotzeh in the chovah of the seudah Purim, because that has to be done in the day. And now the Ramah adds, umikol makom gam balayla yismach ve'yirbe kitzat beseudah. So he's having inyan, which is very different than Chanukah. On Chanukah, there is no chovah to have a seudah. On Purim, there's a chovah to have a seudah in the daytime. And the Ramah is even saying that there's a little bit of a chovah to have a seudah at night as well. But that's not how you say the mitzvah. Big difference, yes?
But you have 2 days of Shulchan Purim in Yerushalayim. How about in Iran that it happened?
Say that again?
Yeah, it's a good question. Shulchan Purim.
Okay, so really you don't have 2 days. You only have 1 day.
Cities are with the walls, but not why. The question is why not in Iran? In Iran, it's only 1 day. In Jerusalem, 2 days.
Okay, not really. What they do in people who live in Israel, especially if they live close to Jerusalem, they find themselves in a unwalled city on the 14th, and then they purposely go to Jerusalem on the 15th. And this way, what happens? They have a chiyuv to have Purim twice, right? But if a person is in a walled city, lives in a walled city, Purim is not on the 14th. Purim is on the 15th. There's no Tachanun, but in the Tefillah, there's no Mikra Megillah on the 14th in a city that doesn't have a wall. What's your question about Iran?
Why not in Iran? They celebrate only one.
Okay, everybody celebrates one. The only way you celebrate two is if you find yourself 1 day in a unwalled city, and then on the 15th you go to a walled city. Then you're required to have 2 days. But you don't celebrate 2 days of Purim if you're living in Jerusalem. It's only 1 day.
And you said the 66 months ended
on Yom Kippur.
Very begin.
6 months before. I'm not sure. 6 months before.
And at that time, they were keeping holidays or no holidays?
They were trying to keep the holidays. The ones who were from, sure, absolutely. The holidays they could keep, right? Kippur, they couldn't do the korbanot, but they were up just like we keep holidays. Presumably they were keeping holidays in Bavel and Paras as well. Sure. But that shows that they probably had the calendar ready by then because there was no Re'iyah of the Chodesh. And that's why the Soda Ibur, it's called the Soda Ibur, that's already from the beginning, which means on Har Sinai, Moshe Rabbeinu was given the calendar. But he was told, by the way, you're not going to use this calendar. They're going to declare the new moon by seeing. But one day the Jewish people are not going to be able to do that. That's when you use the calendar. In fact, there's a famous story in the Talmud that talks about there were witnesses that were lying. And they went to the Bet Din in Jerusalem, right, to testify when they saw the moon. But their testimony was clearly a sheker. It was a lie. And Rabban Gamliel accepted their testimony. And it happened to be Tishri. And Rabbi Yoshua was very uncomfortable. Why was he uncomfortable? Because that means that when you declare Rosh Hashanah, Kippur is going to fall out on a different day. It's a big difference, yeah? This is before there was a concept of 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. It was only 1 day. So now what happens? So Rabbi Yoshua didn't know it. So Rabban Gamliel basically told Rabbi Yoshua that he has to come to him on the day that he thinks it's Yom Kippur with his money belt and his stick, which, of course, Kippur you're not allowed to carry. Okay, and of course, Rabbi Yoshua didn't know what to do. I think he went to Rabbi Akiva, or he went to another Rav, and the rabbi said, "No, do exactly what that is." And when he came, Rabban Gamliel hugged and kissed him. Right? What's the idea? Rabban Gamliel was a descendant of David HaMelech. Right? He was ra'ui to be, potentially Melech had they been worthy to have the Mashiach at that time. But Rabban Gamliel knew the calendar. And the reason he accepted those witnesses is why, even though they were lying, the calendar said today is the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So we see from that Ma'aseh in the Gemara that the idea of the calendar was existent before. They didn't come up with it. It was given on Har Sinai that one day there will be a situation like now where we don't have a Bet Din in Jerusalem and we have to go by the calendar. When the Bet HaMikdash is going to be rebuilt, we're not going to use the calendar anymore. We're going to follow the Re'iyah. And there are certain things like Lo Adu Rosh, Lo Badu Pesach. Rosh Hashanah cannot fall out on a Sunday, on a Wednesday, or on a Friday. Because if it falls out on a Sunday, a Wednesday, and a Friday, the problem is Kippur is 2 days because it's Shabbat and Kippur. You can't have a situation where you have Shabbat and Kippur right next to each other, right? But that could happen when there is by the Re'iyah. So we have certain things that are established because of the calendar. Okay? Answers your question? Okay. Let's continue on. Continuing on in the Shulchan Aruch, we have an extremely unique halakha, which I could probably give a class just on this alone. I'm just going to mention it, and maybe we'll talk about it. Baruch Hashem, we have a lot more time before Purim. Chayav inish livsume b'purya ad delo yada ben arur haman lebaruch Mordechai. Now, this is unique. there's a halacha in the Shulchan Aruch that's telling a Jew that you have to drink to the point where you can't tell the difference between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai. If one thinks about it, that's a lot of alcohol to not recognize the difference. But there's other ways to learn this, okay? And maybe what we'll do, Be'ezrat Hashem, is we'll give a cast specifically on this topic because I think it's important for people to know exactly what the halakha is. Incidentally, the Ramah over here says, the Yesh Omrim, the En Tzarich Lishtaker Kol Kach. There are those opinions that say we don't have to get that drunk. Ela Shishte Yoter Min Limudo. That's the Kobo. A person should drink more than they're accustomed to. So if we're normally on Shabbat and they're sitting having Seudat Shabbat, they'll have 1 or 2 glasses of wine. So on Purim, they should have 3 or 4 glasses of wine. And the goal, of course, is for the person to the Yishan. That's why the mitzvah of Purim is not scotch, vodka, arak. The mitzvah of Purim is yain. Why yain? Especially, ideally, sweet wine. Why? Because in Hebrew, what do you call sweet wine? Yain patish. Why is it called yain patish? Because as soon as you drink too much, you get hit on the head, you go to sleep, right? So that's the idea of yain. So it says ve'ishan umitoch sheishan, when a person is sleeping, eno yodea ben arur haman lebaruch mordechai. So the way one fulfills what and this is what Chamavadia writes, by the way, this is the ideal, that a person should drink more than they're accustomed to. So what then happens is they then go to sleep. And then the person fulfills according to all the deot. The only problem, of course, is what? A person is not allowed to pray when they've drank a riva'it of yain. So that's why the best thing to do is pray minha gedolah, right? And have the seudah, we can do this another time, the seudah should not be right before sunset. The majority of the seudah should be done during the holiday, the day of Purim, not after. So ideally, a person who prays minha gedolah, yes, has already fulfilled the mitzvot of Mishloach Manot Yisrael Matanot Le'Avyonim, begins the Seudah sometime 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then stretches out. They've already prayed Mincha, they go to sleep, and then they wake up and they do Arabit at 10 o'clock. By the time 10 o'clock rolls along, he should be finished with the wine and should be able to pray. If the situation is he's very sensitive to wine, then what you do is you could pray Mincha and Arabit together after Plaga Mincha, fulfill the finish with Arabit, and then you could go, then you could be and you go to sleep and wake up the next morning. Be stuff sake, Kriyat Shema. Okay, so if the way you know a person is doing something l'shem shamayim, because it says in Pirkei Avot, Chacham enav berosho, a wise person, his eyes are in his head, and where's the stupid person's eyes? Also in his head, right? So what does it mean Chacham enav? He looks ahead. He thinks about what's coming. So if I know that I'm going to be drinking now, I have to make sure I'm awake enough that comes time Kriyat Shema, 9, 10 o'clock, I'm able to say Kriyat Shema. That's how you know that the drinking was L'Shem Shamayim. If a person is so drunk that got to schlep his body to the hospital and carry him there, that is clearly not L'Shem Shamayim, because he's clearly not praying Arbit. He probably didn't pray Minha. He's not saying Kriyat Shema. He's incapacitated. Okay, we could talk about that a little more detail because there's other ideas.
This is true?
What's Maaseh Goyim? Getting drunk? That is definitely Maaseh Goyim. Very good. Yeah.
This is so popular today, from many years ago. This is a institution.
Okay, let me answer that question. I'm going to read it again. For Sfaradim and Ashkenazim, there's a little difference. Okay, Sfaradim should not be dressing up. But look what the Ramah says. The Ramah is Rav Moshe Isilis, who's the posek for the Ashkenazim. They don't all follow him all the time. They have other poskim they follow. What does it say? Yesh nahagu lilbosh bigde Shabbat ve'yom tov bepurim vechen nachon. Maharil is the source of this, which is a very famous Ashkenaz posek that discusses the custom of the Ashkenazim. Clearly does not say you should be dressing like a clown or you should be dressing like XYZ. Okay? Now, what you do in your own home when you're having Seudah, you want to dress in a clown suit, kol hakavod. But to come to Bet Knesset like that, that shows a choser yirat shamayim. The Rama would say, you don't come to Bet, you come to Bet Knesset with Bigdei Shabbat, Bigdei Yom Tov. What does the Megillah call? Yemeh, calls it a Yom Tov. So we see there's a level of Yom Tov. That's why, even though it's not Mikra Kodesh, only the Torah can say what's Mikra Kodesh, right? But nevertheless, a person should be dressed up with Bigdei Shabbat on Purim, but not other things. That doesn't mean a person can't dress up, but to come to shul like that. Now, as far as children are concerned, that's a whole other discussion. Depends how old they are. Depends how old they are. If they're very, very young, then it doesn't make a difference, okay? But once they got to chinuch, we should be teaching them the proper way. And the proper way is to come to Bet Knesset properly dressed, not with big day. And it's certainly, while one can argue whether or not one can dress up like a clown, okay, a letzan, which is not a good idea. Just read Mishlei, see what he says about being a letzan, and you don't want to dress up like a clown. But to dress up like a woman, this is again, the Ashkenazim, many of them are lenient in these areas. Some of the poskim are lenient in this. But for Sfaradim, you do not dress up as a woman, or a woman doesn't dress up as a man. We have a lo taseh in the Torah. Lo tilbash gever simlat ishav, lo yeh gever chli gever al ishav, lo yibash gever simlat ishav. Right? So we have a pasuk in the Torah that tells us that a person is not allowed to cross dress. And the Torah doesn't say, by the way, in Purim it's okay. And the rabbi, it doesn't mention the Shulchan Aruch. It doesn't say this in the Shulchan Aruch to dress up. Okay? Anyway, let's continue on. Okay. So we compared the simcha that we have on Purim with Chanukah, and it's different. Yes, there's level of simcha in both. What about another time we have to have simcha, which is regel, on the holidays? Tanu Rabbanan, hayav adam lesameach banav u'bnei beto baregel. A man is required to give simcha to his wife and his children on the holiday. What does it say? It says the simcha is not just for you, it's for your bayit, for your house, which means not just you have to be sameach, you have to make sure that your children and your wife are samechim. Shne'emar, v'samachta b'chagecha. You have to be sameach in your holidays. Now the Gemara says, Bameh mesamecham. What do you make them sameach with? So the Tanakama says, the beginning of the Braita says, yain. Why yain? Yain is samach levav enosh. This we have in Barchi Nafshi. Yes? So we have a pasuk that completely associates the drinking of wine with simcha in the lev. So the first opinion here is that on the regel, a person is supposed to have yain. Now that doesn't mean you give children yain, according to this opinion. It's talking about banav and bnei beto that are older than the age of bar or bat mitzvah. But then the Gemara continues. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, Anashim bera'ui lahem, benashim bera'ui lahem. No, not everybody's happy drinking wine. A person has to analyze what makes that group happy. There are things that make men happy, and there are things that make women happy. Anashim bera'ui lahem. Men, what makes men happy? Yain. The nashim b'mai, but what about you just said? Okay, so women are not made happy with wine. It says yain yisamach levav enosh, and maybe we can learn that not enosh, but man, not enosh as in humanity. Okay, Tanei Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef taught beBavel in Babylon bivigdet tziv'onim. What did the women in Bavel? What made them very, very happy? Colored clothing. So in Bavel, the men had an obligation to buy their wives colored clothing before the regel. The Eretz Yisrael, bivigdei pishtan megohatzin. In Eretz Yisrael, they didn't do colored clothing. They did properly pressed linen clothes. And in those days, linen clothes were very, very expensive. The begadim of the Kohen was made out of linen. These were very, very expensive. Okay, so we understand that simcha, also there's a level of simcha that comes with, first of all, drinking wine. Now, in Masechet Pesachim, we learn something else. Tanya was taught in a Braita. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, Bizman shebedesh bet hamikdash kayam. when the temple was standing, en simha ela bebasar. What basar? Not ala esh. What basar? Basar kadashim. When a person would come to the temple and he would bring a korban, and part of it would go to the shamayim, and part of it would go to the kohen, and then part of it we take home. That basar, that meat, gave such a level of simha, you did not need wine. The simha of the basar alone was sufficient. So when the Torah says "V'samachta behagecha," when the Beit Hamikdash is kayam, what you really need is the korbanot, which is the shlamim that we would bring. There was olah re'iyah they would bring on the holiday. That's olah that goes all to Hashem. But then there's the shlamim, which a person brings. And on Pesach we have a special korban called korban Pesach, which is unique. And maybe we get to Pesach, we'll talk about that more. That's special. That's separate. That's not shlamim, and it's definitely not olah. So we see over here, because we have a pasuk, shene'emar, ve'zavachta shilamim, ve'achalta sham, ve'samachta lifnei Adonai Elohecha. So it says, you shall bring shlamim. Why are they called shlamim, by the way? Why are these korbanot, where the Jewish people eat, are called shlamim? They make shalom between Hashem, between the Kohen, and between the Jew. Because what are we doing together? We're eating in a seudah together.
This is the only one you eat, the rest of them you don't eat.
Okay, korban chatat, the person who brings the korban doesn't eat. The Kohen eats, but not the person who brings the Kohen. Olah, nobody eats. But shlamim, depending if it's a korban shlamim, the zevach, when it's called zevach, that is what? That is shlamim. That is shared by God, by the Kohen, and by the person who brings the korban, and anyone that he wants to invite over to his house. So when the Beit Hamikdash was kayam, only basar was needed, no yain was needed. Ve'achshav she'en Beit Hamikdash kayam, but now, when the temple is no longer standing, en simha ela beyain, there's no simha except with yain. Shene'emayin ma'ar, the yain is simach levavanosh. Now, ideally, if a person wants to be fulfilling the mitzvah the best, you have basar and you have yain. Even though the basar we have is not basar kadashim, it's basar chutz, it's basar that's outside, that's not kadosh, right? But there's a certain level of simha that we have with basar. So the combination of that with yain, that's ideally what a person should be having. And that's why the halacha is, unless a person has a medical reason, when a person on the Yom Tov should be having meat, not chicken, and should have meat, what's called behema, which means lamb or cow. A behema that is worthy to be on the mizbeach. And even though it's not kadashim, we want to get the feeling of what it's like to basically have shlamim. Okay. I'll go for another 5 minutes and then I'll stop. We had a time when Shlomo HaMelech built the first Beit HaMikdash. Yes? Just like we have a seudah, we had 7 days of Chanukat HaBayit, and by Yom HaShemini, Moshe Rabbeinu, for the first 7 days, he did all the korbanot, and by Yom HaShemini, then they did what? That's when Aaron and his sons took over. When they built this first Beit HaMikdash, they had a party not for 7 days, but for 14 days. And what does it say? In Masechet Moed Katan, which of course deals with Avelut, but every now and then it squeezes in something very nice. De'en marvin simcha besimcha milan. Where do we learn the concept of you do not mix two smachot together? I'll give you an example. You have a person who has 2 boys, they're twins, born together, twins. What's the halacha? You do the brit on the first one, and then you do the brit on the second one. You don't do like one cut for both. Each one is entitled, each boy, but the simha is for both. Yes? So, and the same thing with a wedding. En marvim b'simha b'simha. So you're not allowed, while you're allowed to get engaged, you're allowed to give kiddushin to a woman at any time, including on Tisha B'Av. Okay? Why? Because if you don't give kiddushin to her, shemi yikademenu acher, someone else is going to find that prize, and he's going to give her kiddushin, you're going to miss the boat. So kiddushin can be given on the regel, but chuppah is not on the regel. Nobody gets married on Sukkot, not even Chol HaMoed, and not on Pesach. Why not? First of all, it'll probably be ridiculously expensive, but the real reason is why. What's that? No, you could do Suda with matzah, because en mervim simcha b'simcha. We have a mitzvah v'samachta b'chagecha. You can't mix that with the simcha v'kala. The kala specifically is entitled to her own simcha, and therefore we don't mix them together. So we have chag, and then you want to do a wedding motzei chag, no problem. And then you can have a 7-day. You have the 7-day party, which is of course the Sheva Brachot. So Shlomo Melech, what does it say? Vayah Shlomo be'etahi. Shlomo Melech in that time et hechag. When it says the chag, what is that holiday they're talking about? Sukkot. When it says chag, the Mishnah, the language of the Mishnah always, when it says chag, it's only Sukkot. By Pesach, it's called Chag HaMatzot or Pesach, right? Shavuot is called Matan Torah, right? But when it just says in the Mishnah chag, without any identifying term, that's Sukkot. And we see over here in the Tanakh it says, Vayas b'teita chag. What chag was this? Sukkot. The Chol Yisrael imo kal gadol, and all the Jewish people were gathered together. Milavo Hamat ad Nachal Mitzrayim, it's just the distance. Shiv'at yamim v'shiv'at yamim. 7 days and 7 days. Arba'a asar yom. Which means they did the simcha of the building of the Bet HaMikdash 7 days before Sukkot, and then Sukkot came, and they did the 7 days of Sukkot. So they were there for 14 days. What's the problem? Can anybody think of a problem with that? We just said that the Shlomo Melech built the temple, and he made the party for the building of the temple with eating and drinking 7 days before Sukkot, and then Sukkot came, and there was another 7-day holiday. What's the problem?
Yom Kippur.
Oh, wait a minute! Yom Kippur, what's going on? So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Panach, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Otashana, that year, Lo asu Yisrael et Yom Kippurim. Because Shlomo Melech declared that this is the coronation, so they ate on that Yom Kippur. They were worried, and they were saying, Shema nithayivu sonen shel Yisrael kalaya, because what's the punishment for eating on Kippur? Karet. So what are they saying? Maybe they were wrong. Maybe we should not have we should have eaten on that Kippur. Yatzta bat kol ve'amra lahem, an echo came from the Shamayim, which is a low level of prophecy. Kulachem mezumanim l'chayei olam haba. So in the Shamayim, they affirmed that in that situation, you're allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. Now the Gemara says, my darush, where'd you get that from? You can have the party at another time. Where did you learn? How did you learn that it's okay for the purposes of when you built the Bet HaMikdash, the celebration of the building of the Bet HaMikdash? How did you learn that you don't have to fast on Yom Kippur that year? How did you learn that? How did you learn that a 7-day feast for the building of the Bet HaMikdash pushes away Kippur? Amru, Kal Vachomer. They made a Kal Vachomer argument, which is a logical argument. Uma Mishkan, by the tabernacle, she'en kedushato kedushat olam. The kedusha of the Mishkan was not supposed to be kedusha for always, because it moved from place to place. It wasn't set. And even though when they got into the land of Israel, they put it in the place called Gilgal, it was in Nov. But once the Mishkan was destroyed or moved from those places, there is no retention of Kedusha in those places. Just like Har Sinai. Har Sinai, when Hashem was giving the Torah, had a tremendous level of Kedusha. When the Jewish people left, Har Sinai is nothing. That's why it's called Horev. What is Horev? Empty. It had Kedusha, it had a lot of mayim, and then when the Jewish people left, it was dry. So understand from here that the Kedusha of the Mishkan is basically temporary. The Korban Yachid doche Shabbat Isus Kila. And we know Korbanot Tzibur are doche Shabbat. את הכבש האחד תעשה בבוקר, ואת הכבש השני תעשה בין הערביים. What about on Shabbat? What about on Shabbat? You do the Korban Tamid. You have Tamid Shachrit, you have Tamid Mincha. And on Shabbat, you have another Korban. It's called the Musaf. Yes? So on Shabbat, you bring Korbanot. But those are Korbanot of the Tzibur. Or Korban Yachid cannot be brought on Shabbat. That's why the halakha of a prayer of nedava, right? A person could do a nedava prayer during the week, but not on Shabbat. Why? Because there's no individual korbanot on Shabbat. But what do we read? The Nesi'im, they brought korbanot for 12 days. Each day was a different nasi. That was not a korban tzibur, that was a korban yahid. And if they did it for 12 days in a row, what does that mean? At least one Shabbat, they brought the korban. Well, how are you bringing korban yachid on Shabbat? This is not allowed. They should have skipped that day. No. So now what's the kal vachomer? Because the Bet HaMikdash is Kedushat Olam. Once the temple was built by Shlomo HaMelech, that level of Kedusha on Har HaMoriah stays forever. It's a machlok amongst the Rishonim, but the halacha is that place has Kedusha forever. So now, since the Mishkan had Kedusha temporary, and you were doche Shabbat for Korban Yachid, here, of course, you could be doche Shabbat for a Mishkan, a place that's going to be a permanent Kedusha. Okay. So then why were they worried? If there's such a good kal vachomer, why are they worried? Hatam tzorech gavoa, hachat tzorech hedyot. When the Nesi'im brought the sacrifices, even though they were korbanat yachid, really it was for Hashem. It was for gavoa. Okay, but here it was personal parties. So maybe the kal vachomer is not so good, and that's why the Bat Kol came out and said the conclusion of the Gemara is what? En simcha belo achila shtiyah. So based on this Gemara, that's why the halacha is that a person should have basar and yain, especially on Yom Tov, basar and yain. Okay? Purim, since this level of mishteh v'simcha, ideally Purim person should have mishteh with wine and with meat. Of course, you have bread because that's what makes it into a seudah. So we understand that there's a simcha that comes from eating, there's a simcha that comes from drinking, there's a simcha that comes from learning Torah, okay? And there are other simcha, but I think I'm out of time. Does anybody have any questions? I have more to say, but maybe we'll do this on a part 2. Any questions? Okay. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen. So next Wednesday, same bad time,